Right, hey guys, how are we doing? Back another video from Seth the Programmer. This is one I've been wanting to check out for a while. We're going to check out why Goku's brother Raditz beats the big three, so that's Naruto, Bleach, and One Piece. And in my head, I already think, yeah, because Dragon Ball Z, we got characters to blow up planets, and you don't see that kind of stuff in, Naruto, One Piece, Bleach. I mean, you could argue certain things, but grand scheme of thing, I feel like Raditz beating the big three is a given. But let's see the discussion.
Come! Lightning! You already know that, don't you? Getsuga!
This is great. This is awesome.
You call that an attack?
Amazing. So what we're saying is all their ultimate attacks wouldn't even work. Interesting.
Pathetic. Although, it is effective at kicking up dust.
Over 10 years ago, when I first debuted as a power scaler, while I was quite interested in arguing with people and seeing why people believed what they did or what the truth of certain things always was, especially in trying to fund or draw out information or learn things for my YouTube channel, one thing really forced a confrontation more than the others, and that was Raditz versus the big three, which was Naruto, Bleach, and One Piece. Sometimes you may even find a comment actually referencing this Heian age here and there, but that was before I was really ever a thing on YouTube, and I was more so just doing it for fun or making these Windows Movie Maker type videos just for the excitement of it while I did whatever. So in this video, I'd like to explain what the argument was and why at the time is actually really hard to deal with for pretty much everybody. And for some people, it still is. And you may even notice that a lot of people will comment things like Cyberman solos and so on, and these happen to be the vestiges of that, as well as the vestiges of some of the Goku versus One Punch Man
Man stuff,
debates
right?
back in
Yeah.
the day, where technically speaking, the definition of a god-level threat would apply to a Cyberman as someone who could destroy the world. So let's go over the past a bit and even some new arguments, just for old time's sakes,
All right.
for why Raditz soloed the Holy Shonen Trinity. Now, a big thing about Raditz soloing the Holy Shonen Trinity, a lot of you might not even remember that terminology. A lot of people nowadays just call it the Big Three, but it used to be called the Holy Shonen Trinity.
Really, the Holy Shonen Trinity. Okay.
And back then, it was mainly manga only. A lot of people didn't consider anime or movie canonicity for pretty much anything. A lot of the data books were untranslated and
Right.
non-existent. So a lot of the HST had to rely on manga-only arguments to try to fend off against Raditz. And then one thing you'll notice about the HST is that it falls subject heavily to scrutiny or much global skepticism type tactics, whereas with Dragon Ball, much of it is just so blatant and accepted at the time that you would just grandstand and sort of form this empirical wall, and then you would just be skeptical of everything within these HST mangas, as well as the fact that many of their arguments, and especially with, say, Bleach and so on, would use very vague, ambiguous type of badass language, which would make it really interpretive and easy to deny. So I'll go over a lot of that now, and I hope that you do enjoy.
Oh yeah, Phase 1. The first Solo King.
Now, I've explained how strong Raditz is probably a trillion times, but I'll word it a little bit differently for context to sort of build up why he was used and why a lot of people underestimated him at the time. So, for those that don't know, Raditz was sort of the sequel series first antagonist
Yep.
for a lot of people. Like, he was the Dragon Ball Z introductory character, but he is sort of the continuation or the next arc where Goku is no longer trying to be the strongest under the heavens, but the strongest in the heavens. So that's why he starts to fight beings from outer space, right? And then when he eventually defeats Frieza and then Majin Buu, that is when he becomes the strongest in the heavens. But before that, he was becoming the strongest under the heavens. So he was fighting God basically Satan, beings that could just vaporize
Blow up
the
the
moon from out
moon,
of
yep,
existence,
straight away.
beings that could destroy giant wish-granting dragons and gag characters, and there was a lot of build-up before Raditz appeared that would make Goku then have to fight people from outer space. The people on Earth were no longer worth his time. And you see a lot of influence of this. This would basically, Raditz would be basically the equivalent of sort of like a Kage
Yeah.
Momoshiki,
The
Kinshiki type
Otsutsuki's,
character
yeah.
that comes to Earth after the whole thing is over. And it's like, what is that thing? Right? So Raditz, therefore, scales off of people who would nuke the moon in seconds. He scales to Piccolo, who did it hyper casually. Piccolo just flicks his wrist, shoots a laser beam into space, like in a few seconds,
Just
and
gone.
vaporizes the moon, probably at relativistic or light speeds. And then the debris from the moon is just shown flying through space at also relativistic to light speeds. Roshi does the same thing. Piccolo, with the special beam cannon, he creates a blast over 7 times the power level of Roshi, who destroyed the moon in seconds. And then Raditz just blinks out of the way of it, to the point where Piccolo, a person who can therefore nuke the moon out of existence in seconds, is like, no one should be able to move that fast. That's inconceivable.
Yeah.
Even though he's been dealing with people before that. And even though characters like Kami could see characters like Roshi, their strongest and fastest attacks, Kami can't even see Goku and Piccolo moving during their battle when they're at full power.
And then Piccolo
here's
here
Piccolo
is like,
doing this ultra pissing
yeah, and he's like, wait a minute, why didn't I hit him? What the fucking hell's going on?
attack, and Raditz still just dodges out of the way. After Piccolo trains a technique for 5 years straight with the intent
Wow, yeah.
purpose of blitzing Goku and killing him in one
Yeah, that
hit.
was the way the reason he
And
came up with the technique.
That's
yeah.
it. That's why Raditz is just considered so absurdly fast. And it was to the point where his raw power level alone would make him probably dozens of times more powerful than Roshi, just going off of the narrative. Even Goku and Piccolo were multiple times stronger than King Piccolo, let alone Roshi. And then Raditz, just in raw power levels, was almost 10 times that of Roshi, being 1,500, while Roshi was 180. But even then, power levels were not totally linear. So it got to the point where many calculations, especially just for Piccolo's moon feat or even Roshi's, would reach above moon level. The actual fragmentation of the moon and vaporizing it like they do was more so small planetary or planet levels of energy, 10 to the 32 joules of energy, enough to crack the Earth beyond the ability for its gravity to just pull it back together. And Raditz would just eclipse that. It even got to the point where people were like, oh, well, you think these characters can be small planet or planetary, and then it's stated, you know, Vegeta can destroy a planet, or 10,000 power level would be needed to destroy a planet in these guidebooks. But then you would just argue the Earth in Dragon Ball is just bigger than it is potentially in real life. And you'd see that because Toriyama says the moon in Dragon Ball is the same amount of distance as is in real life. He says it in multiple interviews.
Wow.
And then when you look at the moon, or the Earth from the moon, it's actually a lot bigger than it would be in real life, comparatively. So you would just make the deduction that Earth is a small planet in the Dragon Ball universe. It might be bigger than it is in our actual world. And so Raditz being able to destroy it or not doesn't mean he can't destroy a planet in our world. And so you have sort of like this planetary, small planetary, FTL, possibly MFTL being, especially if you think Kid Goku was dodging lasers in Dragon Ball Forever, or beam cannons, such as in Daizenshu. Or, you know, he was reacting to the light speed solar flare from Tien Shinhan that used to be an argument back in the day. Or he just scales to the Kamehamehas that can blitz to the moon in like a few seconds. And then he would be multiple times faster than that, to the point where those beings can't even see him move anymore. And Raditz would just blitz them. They can't even see him move. So these characters that can blitz to the moon surpass multiple times over. And then those characters can't see more characters move, and then Raditz can move so fast those guys can't see him. It was just multiple levels of blitzing. And so Raditz just had this very strong, powerful build where if you were to control him and you're like, well, even if the other verse is stronger than him, he can just throw a nuke at the planet and just life wipe most of it. How is this verse going to deal with it?
Phase 2. The Heian era. Is that how you
First set of
pronounce it?
characters that you would pit them up against were just One Piece. One Piece, even to this day, sometimes would struggle against a Raditz-type argument, proving the One Piece characters are planetary and then FTO. The speed arguments for One Piece, especially these days, are quite good. Many characters are just based off of light or light-based properties, such as Kizaru, Pacifistas. There's many avenues they could take, and then there's many upscalings from those. that would give them multiple times the speed of light if you ask the right person. Some people would say that light speed is the pinnacle. Even Kizaru recently in the manga, let alone way back in the day, was stated to move at the speed of light, and that blitzed pretty much everyone in the show. But back in the day, many people would consider pacifistas to also be light speed, and then the characters would upscale, making them very fast. Then they would argue that they have many types of resistances, like you cannot harm certain types of characters due to their nature. Some characters are just made out of lightning or light or magma or whatever, so how do you even damage them without having hockey or whatever you would need? Other than that, though, they would struggle to prove the planetary. Really, the only character they had at the time being Whitebeard, being stated to be a threat to the world.
Yeah, like they said, didn't they? It's like he's the only person that could actually like split the planet or something, and it's just like, what? And that's like huge for One Piece.
However, a threat to the world could just mean society or whatever have you. These days, we have more context to this statement, and One Piece has evolved, and I'll get into the evolution side of things in a bit, but for now, we'll talk about how it just was at the time. And at the time, it was just so vague. We had so many little details about what all these meant that there was no reason Raditz, realistically, like if you were to control him with the Game Boy controller, you wouldn't just have him float into the stratosphere like Vegeta did over Arlia.
And just blow it all.
Shoot a couple double Sundays at the planet, and the characters would all just explode. Especially because Dragon Ball characters at the time were considered to be able to hurt and harm souls being intertwined with your body, or there were many type of ghosts and illusionary characters that would be harmed by key type attacks. Key type attacks were also considered types of plasma type energy, causing heat transfers or energy transfers. So they weren't just really only a type of physical attack. They were considered a type of energy inherent to your spirit or your body or the energy of the universe itself. It was kind of strange at the time what it was considered, and this was based off of the way that it would burn your body to touch it or the way it transferred energy to you. It was very bizarre back then. Obviously, the current exaggerated version of Ki would be Hakai energy, which is the totally condensed, godly form of
just destruction.
Ki, or the advanced form of Ki, and that just erases you from existence, and they would Hakai ghosts, or they would Hakai you from the timeline, or whatever. But Ki back in the day was considered a very nerfed variation of that description. Obviously, it's not so accurate now, but even just relatively speaking, these One Piece characters, let's be real, they their pants when the clouds move when they fight.
Yeah.
A character that would just send basically
I don't think they'd be able to
bombs
understand what's going on.
basically outer space if he wanted to. Life wiping the planet, possibly multiple times over, of unquantifiable size. With maybe Whitebeard, who was considered a top tier, strongest man of the planet, being even not even relative to it at the time. And it's some people even these days that they're just these country level continental beings. But I'll go into detail a bit later about how they evolved and why that's obviously not the case now. Even the durability negation arguments for One Piece, they can attack your organs or so on, always was a stupid argument. People back in the day would refute it as well. Same thing with Rasen Shuriken from Naruto.
Yeah, okay, fair.
Your internal organs aren't somehow infinitely weaker.
It's attacking your cells!
Or your skin, or your bones, or whatever. So when you get punched in the gut,
your going down to the molecular level.
Like your internal organs have no relative durability to the outside. It was always just a dumb argument, but that was things people would argue about back in the day. So now when you get to like things like Naruto didn't really have data books, and things like Haku, maybe Haku was light speed, but who scales to Haku? Haku still blitzes Kakashi in the war arc. Maybe Madara's Light Fang, people used to translate Madara's Light Fang. Maybe that was light speed, but you were, a top tier 6 paths character can move at the speed of light? That's not so good. Even things like the Raikage being with the speed of light, you just say, okay, well, he still does well against Guru Zetsu. Who cares? No one really scales to him, and maybe KCM Naruto at full power scales to him, and then throughout the rest of the war arc, he's just fatigued. Even when he uses even like fractions of his power, he's still reacting to Rinnegan Obito and Madara while he's giving all his energy away to the Shinobi Alliance. He's slow. Characters don't even have really a planetary level threat until Kaguya. So maybe Kaguya was a threat to Raditz, but does Kaguya scale to the ETSO? These were things that people didn't really know how to argue. And even now, it's just like, why does Six Paths Naruto scale to the ETSO? I mean, he basically immediately folded to it. They had no counter to it. They just had to stop the caster of the jutsu. It's not like they actually contended with its power.
That's true, actually.
Had some type of beam struggle with it. Many things like the Obito tree calc didn't exist back then. That's some really niche argumentation that does exist now. some data book things like, oh, earth-shattering power, he can end the world, just talking about society or shaking the planet a little bit. Many light speed statements are considered flowery language. You can still argue that today, that many of them are flowery language. Even the Kaguya ETSO, you might be able to argue that it's just sort of a barrier hacks jutsu that can expand to the size of a planet, but it doesn't necessarily mean it takes as much energy to do so or that she has that durability. She just might be able to create like a halo array barrier that can expand a long distance. And that was generally accepted at the time. Other than that, it was just genjutsu. Many people would bring up filler where Dragon Ball characters have illusionary resistance. Goku had it in original Dragon Ball where he fights off illusions with his mind, whether it be darkness or whether it be when he has to find the fan with his wife Chi-Chi and he's attacked by illusionary monsters and he uses his third eye to see through illusions. Or you would say in Dragon Ball, Babidi's mind hacks can't control Vegeta because he's too powerful. While the arguments weren't too evolved, neither were the genjutsu arguments. And many people would struggle to prove that genjutsu would affect characters that were not chakra users. Now, even I would argue, what about Manda, the sage creature, or the infinite Tsukiyomi affecting this? People would reply, okay, who uses infinite Tsukiyomi in a combat situation? Who's not just using it for an agenda? Prove it works on a character that doesn't have it. I would argue sometimes that everyone has chakra in the verse, and sometimes that's even supported in current stuff, but it's a little bit inconsistent. But that was the argument against Naruto at the time. Many of the characters struggled to even reach just like country levels. There was no multi-continental Ninetales calc. That was not made until a lot later. Planetary calcs, non-existent. Kaguya, more of a hack she didn't scale to. And that was generally how it was dealt with. Even many characters, One Piece, whether it be One Piece like Whitebeard or Kaguya or the Ten Tails, I'm going to end the world, always considered society, always the skepticism employed. Why are they talking about vaporizing the planet? Why would they vaporize the planet? Why does that make any sense?
Yeah.
And you could argue Raditz might be able to. So it was just always they would fall flat at the end of the day. Bleach fall the heaviest against skepticism. Even today, you would just argue, okay, Yamamoto is just going to burn, say, the Soul Society with his Bankai. Maybe Mimi Hagi was sucked up to Yuha at this relative to light speeds, but that's probably the fastest thing in the series. Why does something being made of light or looking like light or being a beam of light actually make it light? Kamehamehas are described as light. Raditz would upscale up to it multiple times, but we don't consider a Kamehameha a ray of light or as fast as light because it's called a beam of light. They're just describing how it looks like a beam of light. So you would apply that to, say, the Quincy arrows. You would apply that to literally any attack they would describe. At best, they would have the Nagashionn, but many people would just argue that it's like an artificial dimension transporter that just appears like light and is called light as well. Other than that, Yuha destroying the world or whatever, that was just considered tipping the balances of the world. Because he's so strong, and maybe he can move the Vandenreich into the atmosphere with moon levels of energy, that was the calc at the time, then maybe he can tip the balance of these planets enough to where they would fall apart and then go to their original form. Soul King is featless. We have no idea how long it took him to create the world.
Yeah, it's so weird. Soul King, we just... he's mentioned, okay, we got to protect him. Oh no, he's not a thing anymore.
How he did so. So this balance that's being used to keep them apart, we have no idea how it works, no idea how to scale it. There was no information present at the time. No one considered the movie's canon. No one at all used any of those arguments. It did not exist.
I'm pretty sure back in the day people would use the Hellverse as canon because Kubo was involved. I would argue that. I've been watching power scaling videos for quite a while now. Pretty sure the Hellverse was the only one that people would consider canon.
This was not translated. There was no novelization. It was all just vague bullshit ass language, like Aizen saying he was a higher dimensional being. It was all considered generally around that territory, and it was impossible for them to really prove objectively that the characters beat Raditz.
Phase 3. Ascension.
After pretty much a decade of all of this, as One Piece continued, as Naruto got a sequel, as Bleach tended to be redissected, got some novels, and now as recontinued a bit more with the anime, everything seems to have evolved. Raditz also has an evolution, but it is quite different than the others, so I'll get into him last, and why it's not necessarily considered, and why the HST, the big three now, are considered stronger than Raditz. For one, with One Piece, we learned that the One Piece world is probably just a lot larger than our world. Has like 20 million, 10 million islands on it, maybe hyperbole, but has a ton of islands on it. And generally, when you scale it, it's not considered the same as our Earth, and it does seem to be much larger, and many people have calculated to the point where destroying it may be almost star level, if you would believe that. So, generally, Whitebeard's statement of even being able to life wipe this super massive or super titanic planet was a little bit stronger than we initially thought.
Right.
Also, some people would eventually calc stack off of pacifistas, arguing that they are just light-based attacks, to the point where characters would be hundreds of times faster than light. Although, as I said with the more recent chapters and interviews, the speed of light seems to be top tier still in the verse, based off Kizaru blitzing the current fighters on the island. However, that was generally what people did. They would upscale and calc stack to the absurd degrees that Raditz realistically couldn't compete with at the time, maybe being MFTL by like 10 times or 12 times. Really, if you pushed it, if then, maybe FTL, but could not compete with the One Piece calc stack by any means, as well as the really super massive planet Whitebeard scaling, and then you would scale other characters to it as well. Now, once again, One Piece still might struggle with Raditz if you got two really top tier anime nerds to argue against it. You might actually have a good show, especially if Raditz is more skeptical. You may still struggle to defeat Raditz as a One Piece fan, but it was a lot more realistic than it used to be. With Bleach, we learned that Nagashionne really was just sort of a light-based attack. We learned more so that the worlds really were probably more than just planets, that Reo seemed to actually make them, support them, that Yuha was probably going to affect the Garganta and the space around the planets. There's also the movie with Senna within it, where she basically creates a Kaguya-like dimension with a star in it, and then she was going to move it around, and these all just required much more than just planetary levels of energy that Raditz just eventually couldn't keep up with. They also got their own calc stacking as well, with the Ashwelin light being pretty objectively just light speed, and then characters would avoid it. The Bleach planets themselves would also eventually possibly be discovered to be slightly larger than planets on, like, such as our Earth. But all in all, it seemed as though the cosmology of the verse started to expand very massively, especially with the inclusion of Memories of Nobody being kind
what a
of
film.
discovered to be more canon, and with the novel sort of expanding upon what the Soul King's purpose was, what he really did, and how the Bleach universe tended to work. Now, once again, if you get a good debater in there, they will struggle a lot more, and they will have to sort of be a little bit disingenuous, just being straight up honest, but, you know, it's still possible to get Raditz to beat them. With Naruto is probably the most concrete in the sense that you would have Kaguya just creating planets, and then as we learn with all of the inclusions of the mangas, such as The Last, and a lot of the Boruto inclusions, we learned that the stars within the dimensions are just real stars. Even if Kaguya just destroyed a planet with a moon in it, it was massively large planetary, borderline star level. And then if there was a star in there, it's borderline solar system tier. And then we learned later that the Otsutskis are trying to replicate feats of a fourth dimensional god that could manipulate the entire universe. Of course, the data books all came out basically saying every fodder in the entire story was the speed of light or faster than light. You could still argue a lot of his flowery hyperbole, but it got to the point where there really was a good argument that characters were light speed, give or take. The speed was less relevant because of the borderline solar system tier feats. We also started to get some more calc, such as the multi-continental Ninetales calc, the Tengai Shinsei calc, which is multi-continental from Madara, where he was throwing basically debris from outer space or the asteroid belt at possibly light speeds towards the planet. And then you have Ten Tails Obito creating a tree that eclipses almost into the atmosphere faster than lightning, which almost required enough energy to destroy a small planet as well. And then many characters just upscale and be able to one-shot him later. And that's where Raditz started to fall off. We also started to learn that ocular jutsu was used to subdue basically foreign bodies to the Otsutsuki clan, where they're basically just attacking planets that don't have chakra to begin with most of the time. Or they would have to generate chakra by absorbing the energy from the planet or kind of transmuting it in a weird way. It's really kind of convoluted, but it was basically just accepted that these characters probably could genjutsu people even if they didn't have chakra. At least an Otsutsuki level being definitely could. So that is why Raditz started to fall off. Raditz's evolution was a little bit less believable, where Raditz started to become either a Shibai, like higher dimensional entity, or a pseudo-omnipotent entity that was just out-reversal. And the reason that was is because the way of Garlic Jr.'s Dead Space attack, where he creates a hyperspace, or he creates a black hole to absorb people in the Dead Zone movie, and a hyperspace is a higher dimensional portal, and Raditz scales above Garlic Jr.
Yeah.
Create a hyperspace portal.
That's
So
amazing.
the highest interpretation of Garlic Jr. upscaled Raditz to a Shibai-esque being capable of nuking the universe out of
Amazing.
existence. And this was supported by Second Form Frieza, was stated a threat to the entire universe, and so on and so forth. The out-reversal argument was based on the fact that the afterlife was stated to be dimensionally transcendent, atemporal, and possibly just beyond dimensions in some translations and some arguments, to the point where being beyond dimensions would include spatial dimensions and temporal dimensions. So you'd have an inaccessible, possibly outer-versal level being, and Raditz would scale above beings that can interact with these celestial bodies in this higher dimensional or beyond dimensional afterlife, such as Chaozu or Tien, who had a power level barely higher than Raditz. He could shake King Kai's planet. Even Yamcha could work on that planet and affect it somewhat. And King Kai had a linear progression of power from the Z-Fighters, who had power levels not so dissimilar to 1500 of Raditz. Tien had 1830, I believe. Krillin 1700s, Yamcha 1480, Chaozu 610, and he could operate in that world. So Raditz sort of ascended to godhood, and many people just don't accept Raditz's ascension, you know, even as much as I want to. But yeah, that is why, generally speaking, people are like, okay, maybe it's more reasonable just to assume Raditz just doesn't solo the big three anymore. But it's still possible, which is always very exciting for me.
That's
to see,
funny.
as a big
I love
Raditz
that. That's
fanboy.
great. Huh. Fair enough. I like that. So Raditz could potentially still beat the big three. I always think Dragon Ball just beats those verses. it just does. You know, grand scale things. And obviously Raditz the first guy they fight, but you know, like I said, as you scale these things, you rediscover stuff. The Garlic Jr. thing. It's fun. It's fun. I do. You know, I've always enjoyed checking out these power scaling videos. You know, I wish Swag Kage would come back and do videos as well. I want all the old guys to come back. I want Clyde to do regular videos. I want Seth to do regular videos. I want Six to collab with the ball. You know, it's always good, the versus stuff and that. It's just, I miss those days, man. I miss them so much. But yeah, that was awesome. Thanks for watching.